Introducing the new Starbucks Pairings menu, where you can get a tall brewed coffee or tea, hot or iced, paired with a croissant starting at $5, or with a breakfast sandwich starting at $6. Because at Starbucks, we know that some things are better together. Limited time offer at participating stores. Restrictions apply. Visit starbucks.com/pairings to learn more.
Celebrate incredible savings during NFM's 4th of July sale. Pay 55 cents on the dollar, plus take an extra 11% off the current price on all furniture, carpet, and area rugs. Get up to $1,000 off appliances. The more you buy, the more you save. Save up to $500 on select electronics. And get 24-month financing on qualifying purchases. Shop amazing store-wide savings during NFM's 4th of July sale happening now. Minimum monthly payments required, 18% APR. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
To get the Crime Writers on After Show right now, go to patreon.com/partners in crime media.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And on this episode, a killer turns his life around in prison. Will the family of his victims grant him forgiveness and find their own internal peace? We'll look at season 2 of The Letter, Ripple Effect. Joining me to get that done and more is true crime author, TV journalist, and host of These Are Their Stories podcast, my husband and love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hi, Kevin.
Buenos tardes, Rebecca.
Also with us is private investigator, certified pet detective, resident cat lady, and author of The Final Curtain, Laura Bricker. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Rebecca, an aspiring medieval Renaissance wench.
Can't wait to hear about that. And finally, our
You don't
captain...
have to aspire. You are already a wench.
I know. Well, she's the loveliest kind of wench. She's a good wench. And
Yeah,
finally, our
you're a good
captain of
wench.
all
What a
things
bad
cynical.
wench.
I was called a witch this weekend. Multiple times.
By
Oh,
whom?
no. Did you go to another wedding?
We got to talk about that in the after show.
No.
And finally, our captain of all things cynical, author of the City Trilogy, host of Stranger Arrivals, and our Patreon Deep Dive Book Club podcast host, Toby Ball. Hi, Toby.
Hi, Rebecca.
So, Kevin, this is Monday's podcast.
Yes, it is.
What's coming up on Thursday's program?
On Thursday, we're going to be talking about the Netflix documentary, Tell Them You Love Me.
Oh.
Yeah.
Speaking of documentaries, can I make a plug?
You may.
There is a brand new podcast documentary project out by my day job outlet, New Hampshire Public Radio, hosted by Jason Moon, the host of Bear Brook. You might know of him. It is called the Youth Development Center. It is a 3-part podcast about, I think, the biggest scandal to ever unfold in the state of New Hampshire, a years-long pattern of abuse at a youth incarceration center, basically, in New Hampshire.
Decades long.
Decades
It's incredible.
long.
Yeah.
More than 1,300
series.
victims, and it is so good. I listened to all 3 parts this morning when it first dropped. I had heard early versions of the series, and I was completely blown away by the finished product of this thing. It's also got an incredible digital presentation that goes along with it that was done by people at The Pudding, which is this amazing digital viz data outlet. It is so good. Look for the Youth Development Center everywhere you get your podcast. It's not a long listen, and it's a hard listen, but Jason is so good at telling these kinds of stories that you will not regret listening to it, and you will have so many holy shit moments. Really, he's breaking a story nationally here that I cannot believe people don't know about. Right, Kevin?
Yeah, it's a really great series. And what's it called again?
The Youth Development Center.
The Youth Development Center.
Laura, you're familiar with this case, right?
I'm familiar with it, and I have met some of the folks that were abused through my travels, and so I'm really glad that this story is getting out there.
Yeah, me too.
Hey, I just got one other thing to add for folks that next week we're starting our summer schedule. So we will have new episodes of Crime Writers On every Monday throughout the summer, and we will be doing classic rewinds of some of the best Crime Writers On reviews from the best titles in true crime on Thursdays.
It's a good opportunity to listen back to some of the funniest things we've ever said, the weirdest things we've ever reviewed. I love the rewinds.
Yeah.
I have to say, I actually love them. They're so fun. All right. Well, we're not rewinding now. Should we get to what we're talking about in this episode?
How about it?
All right. Let's drop that first clip. Leading off.
I just had a feeling something was going to happen. I just had this feeling several days before, and it just kept getting stronger and stronger.
In 1982, restaurant manager Michael Moore shot accountant Jordan Rasmussen, then laundry driver Buddy Booth, who discovered the body. Though he escaped the firing squad, Moore sought advice from the sentencing board on how he might someday win his release from prison.
I don't want to overstate this, the board member said, but you can certainly impact the amount of time you serve. She explained that once they feel an inmate has paid their debt to society, it's really a question of what an inmate has done with their time behind bars.
Give back.
Give back a little, she said.
The murders left gaping holes in the lives of the victims' families. But when they learned Moore was an exemplary prisoner who was contrite about his crimes, some saw the killer in a new light. They began a process of forgiveness, one to provide compassion for Moore and one to heal their own pain they'd been carrying for years.
I just remember writing this letter, and it wasn't me writing it. I remember that. I remember I am not writing these words. I don't know where these words are coming from, but I am penning something that I am not engaged with. It just came out. It just flowed.
From Lemonada and KSL Podcasts comes the second season of The Letter, Ripple Effect. Host Amy Donaldson brings another unlikely tale on the power of restorative justice. Could a grieving family recover by extending mercy to Jordan and Buddy's killer? And can Moore be completely rehabilitated? Or is he just playing the family in a long con to get out of prison? Spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about plot points from The Letter, Ripple Effect. So if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes for our thumbs up, thumbs down reviews. So Laura, there's a long setup to this podcast, right?
Yeah. So we have this introduction scene with Jordan Rasmussen's last day. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of background. We kind of come into it hearing that his last night was kind of remarkable. And anybody that remembers his last night sort of remembers it because it was really who he was. You know, he got home, his kids were asleep, his wife was out. He ended up kind of walking around with his infant son, Chad, trying to kind of calm him down, ended up getting like locked out of the house. And then, you know, they throw in that thing like he didn't know it'd be his last night on earth or something. But then we segue into this like huge long background about his whole life story and how he landed where he is. And I was like, what happened to the murder? So there was a lot of information, but for me, I felt like it took me out of the suspense of knowing that this guy was going to be a murder victim, because we then segued into, I don't know how many minutes of backstory about how he was working at the restaurant and how this was his job and how this had been happening and that had been happening and da-da-da-da-da. And then we're like, okay, now he's going to get killed. I mean, not that I want him to, you know, but it was like the suspense and the power of that moment of setting up that murder scene where, by the way, we had all the details, was for me kind of just bogged down because we had so many other details.
Yeah. Kevin, what did you think about the structure of this series? I saw that you had a note about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not convinced that the structure of the narrative is the best. It's not until like either the end of episode 4 or really beginning of episode 5 for me that things get really interesting. And that's like when we start talking about the family getting together and, you know, this whole concept of restorative justice. You know, as we said like 2 weeks ago when we were talking about Dead Men Running, trial episodes can be real momentum killers because they're spending 30 minutes to an hour telling us what we already know. We already heard the details of the crime. And we already also know that this defendant is not going to get the death penalty, right? Because otherwise it's like end of the podcast, right? So we already know some of these things. But I will say, I think that the series recovers, although I'm not positive what the antidote is for the thing that I just said. In season 1 of The Letter, you remember that first episode ends with a really powerful phone call between Cy and George. And in it, she says, I love you to him, and like hangs up. And that locked you in like, what the hell is, like, it was just really amazing. Now, I guess the visit to the jail, that scene is close because it does sort of send, I mean, you know, in episode 1, when the two family members go like right away to talk about forgiveness and they're turned away. It does set up the idea that Moore is not remorseful and that the family is prone to forgiveness.
They could tell how distraught we were, of course.
Did you want answers from him? Did you?
I don't know. I think we just wanted to say, oh, we can't believe, you know, you are just going to be devastated when you find out what you've done. And what on earth could have caused this? Because, you know, it was just such a shock.
And it didn't make sense.
It didn't make sense.
This series doesn't have that super gut punch that made this Laura's number 8 podcast of 2022.
Yeah.
And Rebecca's number 6 podcast.
I loved the letter season 1. I loved it. I thought it was so surprising.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was just so different. Like, we just don't listen to true crime podcasts that have that particular angle. And, you know, it's sort of like this look into the Mormon community, which isn't a look we typically get into a community that sort of has faith at its center. And like, I think we look at a lot of stories around faith from a very cynical point of view, and like the dark side of faith and the culty side of faith. And there's plenty of stories to tell there about the Mormon community. And this was one story that sort of, you know, told the side of faith that like people are bound by other ideals that help them do something different than people who don't have that kind of faith do. I just thought it was a very interesting story. I don't know. I really, really liked it. It was structured very, very well.
Can you just explain what you mean by do things that other people wouldn't do if they didn't have faith?
I'm not saying I'm saying maybe consider earlier doing things that it might take people a little longer to do. You hear that in this podcast too. You hear people, and by the way, I am, as you know, an atheist. I have a lot of issues in particular with Mormonism. I'm just going to throw it out there right up front. That being said, you do hear the language of people looking for a reason to get to a better place a lot faster, I think, than you hear people without sort of a religious or faith-based life center do in this podcast. You hear a lot of vengeful shit from family members of victims and other crime stories before they get to this place. And maybe they were there. Granted, this was a long time ago, so maybe we're just missing that from the narrative. But I don't know. To me, it's just an interesting point of view on a community that we don't get. It's not the abducted in plain sight story. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, Toby, I think that the point Rebecca was putting down that I picked up on at first was that we've seen things like with LDS that faiths tend to weaponize forgiveness. Right. And it's mostly to cover up the misdeeds of their leaders and the guys who has 40 wives or whatever. So if you admire the Rasmussen's grace and ability to forgive, it's undeniable that trait was born within their faith, and that's how they got there faster. I don't know if you have any opinion on that.
Well, it just struck me also, too, that the one kid who left the church had more of a problem getting there, too, than his parents did. I don't know. I'm not saying one thing is better than the other. It was just interesting to me. What are your thoughts, Toby?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I want to get into this. I think there's some interesting questions they don't really go into, which is like, what is actually forgiveness?
Yep.
Right? You know, is it something that you're doing because you've been told all along that that's something you're supposed to do, so your initial reflex is to forgive? Are you trying to emulate somebody whose example you've been shown as being what you should aspire to, and therefore you forgive? Or is it some kind of like empathy that you feel towards the person who you're forgiving, or some kind of understanding, and you're forgiving because of that? And I guess that was a question I had. And I think when people say, you know, it came from my faith, it's like, okay, that's fine, but what does that even mean?
Right.
What about your faith is leading to believe this? Is this just like, if A, then B, and B is forgiveness?
Yeah.
Or is it, I strive to be a better person by forgiving people because that's a value that's been handed down to me?
Yep.
Or is it, I feel like my faith allows me to put myself into other people's shoes, right? And sort of try and understand where they're coming from or whatever, and I can get to a point in which I can forgive them.
Right.
And that's not really, I mean, maybe it was tackled in this. It wasn't
on its face tackled in this.
This is not a podcast for me.
Yeah.
And it makes it a little bit difficult for me to critique it, just because it's like trying to tell you whether I like a tuna fish sandwich or not. I just don't like tuna fish, so I'm not going to like any of them.
Listen, I was talking about season 1, Toby. I wasn't talking about this season.
Now we know that I will not be making a tuna fish sandwich.
Do not make it.
What if I grill some tuna on the grill, Toby? Tuna steak?
No, I don't like that either. I'm trying to drop hints in case I come over to your place.
Okay. Salmon? You like salmon?
I'm not a big fish person. Yeah, so I guess that was kind of one of the things I was thinking about, sort of what is the nature of forgiveness? And I think they don't quite like jump into that question as much as sort of like what is the process by which people forgive, or what is it necessary for these people to kind of see or feel from Mike in order to feel so the conditions are right where they can forgive him. Yep. And again, I don't feel like they go quite as much into this as I thought would have been interesting, which is, is it important for it to be sincere, and how much of it is it important for him just to do?
Right.
Right. And that was just another thing that, you kind of see some people think it's sincere. Chad had his questions about it. But in the end, like what allowed you to sort of afford that forgiveness to him? Yeah.
I mean, the point comes up over and over again that the forgiveness isn't for him. It's for them, which, is what people say about forgiveness. But Laura, you have a big old note, which I share, about whether or not he was believable more and whether or not you could empathize with him in any way.
Yeah, I had a really hard time empathizing with him. I felt like he learned the system in terms of what he needed to do well, first of all, let me say, when I go back to the lack of empathy that I have for him, because I can find empathy in a lot of, I do this criminal defense work. I work in this field. I can usually find empathy for people landing in the situations they're in. What struck me initially was like this very clinical confession that he has. And you hear about the way that the murders were carried out. And then you hear about like all of his excuses of like, oh, the Chinese mafia or whatever is coming for me. Then it's like he goes to the first parole hearing and he's still like about himself. And like he doesn't mention anything about the victims. He says he wants to express his remorse for what happened to Jordan, but he doesn't acknowledge that he's the one who killed Jordan. He doesn't say he's sorry. He doesn't mention Buddy at the first parole hearing. He's just trying to sort of justify why he did what he did. And he's trying to kind of be like, I'm the victim here. And then he's like, oh, that doesn't work. Let me look and talk to other people that are incarcerated about what does work. And he comes back and I'm like, just like Pam Smart, who just finally came out after all these years with like an actual apology because it wasn't working for her either.
He begged for a lifeline, something more specific than be good and hope for the best.
What can I anticipate after that if I maintain my present course? Can you give me some ray of hope is what I'm asking.
A ray of hope.
I think going back to what Toby was saying about like, who is the forgiveness for? It's for these people because like you can't be consumed by hate and you can't be consumed in this cycle of hating this person if you want to go on with your life. You've already gone through like the stages of grief and you're going to be stuck. So I look at it like it's for the victims' families to be able to reach a place where they can let go, not necessarily believe him. And some of them, I think, have convinced themselves they have to believe him to let go. Others are like, I think, more realistic and actually understand what's going on there. But it's like you can't get stuck in that perseveration loop of, I hate this guy, I hate this guy, I hate this guy, I hate this guy, and actually expect to have a quality of life at all after something like this impacts you, right?
Yeah. So I didn't love this season at all. I'll just throw it out there. And part of it was structural. Part of it was because it was very surface and sort of mulled like that issue. Moore is there were some things about his character that weren't addressed and some things about his stories that weren't addressed. First of all, floating this whole idea about like this like Taiwanese owners and their like foreign mob connections is so fucking xenophobic and ridiculous. And the fact that like he could float it as like this plausible thing is ridiculous. But then the fact that he like went back to it again and again and again shows that there's really something very off. But then later we hear in his own voice him telling this story about wanting to seriously harm a fellow inmate and then having to go get instructions from somebody on how not to cause that person harm. I need to be reminded how not to do that. And I'm like, this is like not a fully reformed like human being.
Well, can I like
yes, I would
make
love
a counterpoint?
I would love to hear your counterpoint.
So let's set aside that he'd been in prison for 25 years and never had a serious write-up, that he did all these. I mean, we're just like glossing over the fact that he was self-taught 5 languages. He did all these, these things that people found amazing in a model inmate and whatever.
And prison is bad.
And prison is bad, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's just skim over like all those things that make him look good for a second. He said at one point in one of the hearings that like what he didn't know then that he knows now is that when he was, and he didn't use the term paranoid or whatever, but that when he thought he was in this situation that he was going to have to use violence, the thing that he knew now that he didn't know then was that he should have gone to a police officer, turned in his weapon, and said, look, this is where I am, and I need help. It was, for him, it was some sort of recognition that, it's not the fact that you have the feelings, right? It's the fact that you act on them, the homicidal feelings, and that he was trying to model something positive, as opposed to just the fact that, like, he felt like he wanted to, get revenge on the guy that fucked up his 25 years of a clean record. Like, I think that in of itself is the kind of thing, like, one might be able to understand. But I mean, if you're going to say, oh no, he went to another guy and said, I need some help. Can you help me, so that I don't commit violence? If you look at it and saying, he wants to commit violence, as opposed to looking at it as he's trying to do something productive to not be violent, and that should be rewarded, then, it's kind of like, which way do you look at it? Like, you could say, hey, when I support us on Patreon, I am getting something for myself. I'm
just like
getting exclusive podcasts.
Yeah, it's just like that.
Or you can look at it and say, when I support the Crime Writers on Patreon, I am sustaining the podcast that I really love, right?
Quite the pitch.
But it doesn't matter which it is.
We're in the business section.
Or you can find a cop to talk you out of it.
That's right.
No, don't find a cop to talk you out of joining Patreon, because we got all sorts of great stuff.
Or you can send some money to a Mormon kid to help him with their mission.
Yeah.
I think some of those Karen Reed cops would probably talk you out of it. Just go ahead.
So this is my business section,
okay.
Not their business section. We're almost up to 600 exclusive podcasts behind the paywall at Patreon, and we have all sorts of great stuff. We always have for you the Crime Writers on After Show, where we get together and continue the conversation. You know what we're doing today?
What are we doing?
We have a great listener that we all know. His name's Jeff Brumley, and Jeff has been tinkering with ChatGPT. Now, if you have been listening to Rebecca's bonus podcast on Patreon, all about the Karen Reed trial, one of the episodes Jeff came on, and the addendum at the end was he ran things through ChatGPT. Why is that a tongue twister?
ChatGPT.
And it spit out like some things about...
he wrote haikus about some of the main figures in the case. They were quite good.
Oh, my.
Well, Jeff has also done something very similar for us here at Crime Writers On, and we'll see if ChatGPT can predict our thumbs up, thumbs down reviews and tell us a little something about ourselves.
Amazing.
That's going to be fun. But also other great things you get on Patreon include Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast, Laura Bricker's Leave It to Bricker podcast. We have Married with podcast. You can also get us early and ad-free by joining us at the Let's Do What We Do level. And if you're a deep diver, you get to not only listen to Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club, but you also can watch him record it. The next recording is coming up here in July, and the book is called The Brothers. Toby Ball, are we talking about the Marx Brothers? The Warner Brothers? Which brothers?
No, not those brothers. It's the Tsarnaev brothers, who were the
I was hoping it was
two
the
people
Kelsey
who
brothers.
perpetrated the Boston Marathon bombing. It's by Masha Gessen, who... if you read The New Yorker, you've probably read some of their stuff. They teach at Amherst College. And I'm underway in this book, and it's pretty interesting. So early returns are very promising.
So all those great things, just join us at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia. You'll get all that great stuff. And lastly, I'm going to ask you to sign up for our newsletter. Absolutely free. You go to crimewriterson.com. Drop in your email address. We got thousands and thousands of people that get it, and
it's so good.
It costs us money. It costs us money because we got so many.
Oh, can I just say something about the newsletter?
What?
I oversee some newsletters at my job for many years. I have never, ever, I've sent newsletters at my job to like 40, 50,000 people. I have never had a person write in when they didn't get it and say, where is my newsletter? This happens all the time when someone's a Crime Writers on newsletter subscriber and like it ends up in their junk mail, or they're like, Kevin, where's my newsletter? It's so fucking fun and good, and like people miss it when they don't get it. It's that fun.
Yep.
It's fun.
Yeah, now I gotta go write a newsletter. Geez, thanks,
Rebecca.
Sorry,
Kevin. It's like being inside your brain for 5 minutes. It's so fun. All right, Kevin, does thus end the business section?
Thus ends the business section.
I'm gonna go and fade that music out right now.
They say plants like music. Yeah, no, like really, they respond to the vibrations of it, which means that this playlist you're listening to, the plants are too. You know what else plants like? Organic soil from Miracle-Gro. It's made with all the best stuff like wood fiber and compost. Plus, it's OMRI certified organic, which officially means it's made with superior ingredients. And when you give your plants the stuff that makes them happy, they won't judge you on your iffy playlist. Hear that, plants? So go ahead and give them Miracle-Gro.
Shop the Sherwin-Williams July holiday sale and get 30% off paints and stains from June 28th through July 8th. With prices starting at $34.29, it's the perfect time to transform your space with color. Whether you're looking to revamp your bedroom, living room, or home office, we have you covered with bold hues, soothing neutrals, and everything in between. Shop the sale online or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store. Click the banner to learn more. Retail sales only. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
Celebrate incredible savings during NFM's 4th of July sale. Pay 55 cents on the dollar, plus take an extra 11% off the current price on all furniture, carpet, and area rugs. Get up to $1,000 off appliances. The more you buy, the more you save. Save up to $500 on select electronics. And get 24-month financing on qualifying purchases. Shop amazing store-wide savings during NFM's 4th of July sale happening now. Minimum monthly payments required, 18% APR. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
So Toby, obviously Jordan died, and that's incredibly sad. Buddy was also a murder victim here. We get a short portrait of Buddy's like imperfect life. His parents obviously didn't participate in the podcast. We get most of the portrait of him from his surviving wife. Jordan, however, gets a lot of setup in the podcast, and he is the Dateline victim who can light up a room, right?
Yeah, I as we've said many times, like you kind of get it, especially if it's, a relative or a good friend or whatever. You're not going to speak ill of the dead and all this. But I think so much of this is based on the hole in the lives of these people that's left when Jordan is killed, that I don't feel like we get a very full picture of him. Even if he's the greatest guy in the world, which he very well may be. I mean, he sounds like sort of universally beloved and all this stuff. There's got to be more to him than what we hear, right? I mean, there's got to be more than just, he'd share his souvenir money, or he wanted to play BYU basketball, but he wasn't good enough, or any of these things that are sort of like kind of heartwarming and endearing and all this. So in the end, it just feels like it would have been more effective if you had a better feeling for Jordan as being like a real human being who was no longer in these people's lives. Instead, you get this sort of, idealized maybe isn't the right word, but sort of selectively revealed picture of him. And for me, it's always kind of hard to kind of identify with that because it kind of falls into this sort of generic, lovely person taken from us too young. And I think the ones that are really effective and that really give you a sense and sort of, I think, are more sort of emotionally affecting are the people who you realize that these are like sort of full-fledged people with their faults or whatever. And like even the best person among us with the best, intentions at all times just has faults. I mean, that's just kind of being human. And you don't have to freaking dwell on them, but giving a sense of a person who's real rather than a person who's kind of idealized, I think would have made sort of all the emotions that you're really trying to sort of tap into during the course of this podcast feel a little more understandable or whatever, because there'd be a real person at the center of it.
No, I agree. I mean, listen, to me, the most person I found most resonant in the podcast was Buddy's daughter, who talked about how, she didn't remember him, obviously, because she was very young when he died, but talked about how her mother remarried very quickly and ended up marrying a child molester, who, by the way, she was told to forgive or basically, she ended up forgiving because of I think she was raised in a culture of forgiveness.
Knowing that he was in jail, he was getting his own therapy sessions, and he was on the road of recovery and understanding and feeling more remorse. And he was sorry for what he had done. I feel that he deserved a second chance.
But she's, she's a Wiccan now. She was a very interesting person to hear from, and how her life, talk about ripple effects, was affected by her father's untimely murder. Laura, I have a question for you. We learn shortly into the podcast that Amy's husband was one of the defense attorneys who worked for Michael Moore. What did you think about that revelation?
it was very interesting because I don't think it was until like episode 3 or 4 that information came out. It wasn't like right in the beginning.
It was close to episode 2, maybe?
Episode 3, did they get to the trial?
3? Okay.
Yeah, it was episode 3. And she just like, she says that, yeah, you should know, like, Ed's my husband. We weren't married back then. We didn't meet for like years afterwards. And then like, hey, I was looking in this story. I had no idea he was involved. And then he's like, oh yeah, I worked on that case. And she discusses sort of the process that they went through, because normally that would be a conflict of interest, but where like the mission of this story was different than like sort of a straight journalistic story that's focused on kind of maybe telling something in a more straight news story style. They were like, oh, okay. And also, I mean, here's the other reason. Her husband is now the only person that's still alive from this defense team.
Yeah.
So they kind of set some rules and some boundaries, and they carried on. I thought it was interesting, though, they mentioned it, and then they didn't mention it again.
Yeah.
and I was like, okay, so that's interesting. So like if you
she referred to him by name in the podcast later, but like didn't say my husband, comma.
My husband, Ed. It was like, we're just going to like pretend like you're going to remember that we mentioned that Ed is my husband. And Ed had some good things to say. Like Ed talked about like how this case stuck with him, and the way that this guy confessed, and the way that he was so clinical about describing the crime, and and
didn't
also
stick with him enough to ever bring it up over dinner over the next.
Apparently not, though. Like, hey, when they got together, there was this case I worked on that was crazy.
I got to tell you, you know what I would have done? I would have used it. Like,
I would have leaned into it more.
Why not have them talk about it? Like, we know now that you guys are married. Like, why not bring some of that intimacy, like this thing we didn't know that now we know? You worked on a thing that I'm now working on. Like, have the producer there for sure, but why not do that? Like, why not have a thing where your work lives are now intersecting? Like, that's interesting. Right. I don't know. Kevin, what do you think?
I think they did it well. I mean,
you didn't mind?
No, I mean, first of all, who else are you going to turn to? I do think it's funny that, like, it didn't come up, or I guess I could see that, but they were transparent about how they wanted to work it.
Yeah,
I think either way would have been fine. They disclosed it. They said we're going to have someone else do those interviews and put it together. I didn't see a big problem with it.
Speaking of not disclosing things, what about the woman who wrote the letter to Moore on her, like...
Oh, Jesus.
Basically, it sounded like I called him...
Can you fucking believe that?
What?
Well, was it the sister? Like after what I'm talking about is after that that parole hearing where the family goes and they start thinking about maybe there's a chance to forgive Michael Moore, and it starts going through this one woman's head, and she writes this letter and she says, "We, on behalf of the family, we forgive you, and you're our brother." And then she takes photocopies of the letter, or the first draft, and then she shares them with everybody in the family saying, I went ahead and did this. I think somebody would be like, hey, maybe you should have checked with us. Thank you for signing off on all this. I mean, it's great because it did open.
What do you mean we?
Yeah, what do you mean we? Yeah, pretty presumptuous. But I mean, it did start this sort of chain reaction down the road where everybody in that generation was able to come to terms with it and find some forgiveness and open up with this peculiar, unexpected relationship with the man that took away their loved one. I also thought it was interesting. I think Toby started touching on this when we get to Chad and his siblings, Jordan's kids. This was kind of a new thing, that we kind of bring to these stories when we do have them, that they've only, grown up with the pain, but everybody around them has moved on from that pain, and they're already told about, forgiveness. And so it sort of denied them growing up their right to be angry, right? And develop their own feelings about their father's loss. What was, I want to say good or bad, but like how to interpret that, because it seemed like everybody around them has already decided, I want to say for themselves, but there might be this very implicit aura within the family that, well, no, you can't be angry at Michael Moore because we've all forgiven them. I mean, the siblings, their lived experiences are so different from that older generation. But I was glad to see that, for their own sake, they found peace with it. Just that their road there was slightly different than their mother and their grandparents and their aunts and uncles.
Obviously, a huge spoiler I'm about to reveal in the story. If you have not listened to a lot of the letter, you're about to hear a huge spoiler in the story. Toby, Michael Moore dies by suicide in prison. And, there's mixed reactions to it among the family. I'm really glad they left the tape in of somebody saying they were relieved because they didn't know how to feel about him coming out. I mean, I can imagine a lot of people felt that way. And one person was brave enough to say it on tape, and I'm glad they included it in the podcast.
I felt sad that he had taken his life, but I also did have that sense of relief. You always hear stories about how hard it is to get used to life outside of prison. And so in the back of my mind, I would think like, what if he doesn't adjust to his life outside of prison?
I mean, I was very surprised to hear that some of the family members were thinking about putting him up when he came out. But what did you think about that turn in the story that he died by suicide in the prison? Of course, there's a conspiracy theory that he potentially didn't, but it seems to be that he did.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of a jolt in the story, right? Because this whole thing is this arc of the families forgiving him and him, whether it's sincere or not, doing the work they needs to do to get out and to earn their forgiveness and all this stuff. And then right before sort of what would be the payoff, like two things happen. One is he screws up and he kind of like does this little petty thing that's going to screw his chance to get out when he thinks he's going to, and it's going to be like years and years more in prison and all this stuff that he's done. And this kind of clean slate that he's kept while he's been in there is kind of out the window. But it does get you thinking, or at least it got me thinking about this idea, especially if you kind of come across the idea that he's sincere, the fact that he's kind of living, for 25 years or whatever, knowing the people who got affected by this decision that he made to kill their loved one and how that's got to weigh on you, right? And the idea of this sort of pervasive, sort of unending guilt, which I would imagine would be even exacerbated by the forgiveness that you're given, in that it's hard to somehow justify in your head that there's something kind of came out of it when you see these people are being very, obviously generous towards you in their attitude towards you, how difficult that must be. But like maybe there were hints about it before, like they had actors reading his words and stuff. I wasn't sure if it's because they couldn't access him in prison or whatever. But yeah, it kind of comes out of nowhere and sort of, the sort of payoff that you would have been expecting, and this is just looking as a story, as it's in the story arc, just doesn't kind of happen, right? It stops.
Final question, Laura. Back in the day, you could prepare and do a death penalty trial in a matter of months, and then they were killing people by firing squad. There's a lot of people on death row in the United States, and I think it's in large part because these trials used to be very quick in a way that they aren't anymore. What are your thoughts about that?
I was like blown away by that. So the murders happened in March. They tried the case by August. That's like in the modern times in our little state of New Hampshire, that's like a district court case. A felony case is usually over a year. A death penalty case should be much more than that because of the amount of work that's going to go in. You're literally fighting for somebody's life. And they were like, it was on a fast track, get her done, like Larry the Cable Guy or something. And it's like, basically, they also talked about like, okay, we're just going to put together like character references and like beg for this person's life. We're not going to talk about guilt or innocence. We're just going to like beg for this person's life. And I'm like, that's literally your defense in this case. And firing squad. Like when I heard that, I'm like, death by firing squad.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
But
like an Executioner's song. That was in Utah, right? The Norman Mailer. Yeah.
So, I mean, when you think about that, homicide in March, trial by August, death penalty trial. And you wonder why, again, like you just said, Rebecca, there are so many wrongful convictions, especially death penalty cases that have been people that have been sitting on death row for decades or whatever because of things like this. So that was pretty shocking. But then it's like, then you segue from that into just like the years and years afterwards of this guy trying to like, work the parole system and this eventual end. So I'm glad that we have some more checks and balances now in the modern criminal justice system in a way to keep it fair. But that was horrifying to me.
They say plants like music. Yeah, no, like really, they respond to the vibrations of it, which means that this playlist you're listening to, the plants are too. You know what else plants like? Organic soil from Miracle-Gro. It's made with all the best stuff like wood fiber and compost. Plus, it's OMRI certified organic, which officially means it's made with superior ingredients. And when you give your plants the stuff that makes them happy, they won't judge you on your iffy playlist. Hear that, plants? So go ahead and give them Miracle-Gro.
Celebrate incredible savings during NFM's 4th of July sale. Pay 55 cents on the dollar, plus take an extra 11% off the current price on all furniture, carpet, and area rugs. Get up to $1,000 off appliances. The more you buy, the more you save. Save up to $500 on select electronics. And get 24-month financing on qualifying purchases. Shop amazing store-wide savings during NFM's 4th of July sale happening now. Minimum monthly payments required, 18% APR. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
You're a pro. You can make a 5-ton HVAC condenser purr like a sleeping kitten. Weeds cower at your mere presence. The only thing cleaner than your clients' homes is your reputation. So why is a pro like you still stuck in the endless cycle of paperwork, scheduling, spreadsheets, and chasing invoices? Automate your office and get back to what you love with Jobber, the all-in-one tool that fits your entire office in your back pocket. Start your free trial today at jobber.com.
All right, let's do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out The Letter, Season 2, Ripple Effect? Laura Bricker, what do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down for this podcast?
So I'm going thumbs down with this. I just struggled to connect with this podcast and take anything from the message that I knew we were supposed to be getting. And I think what it was, because I was trying to think, like, we all know I'm all about restorative justice. I'm about seeing that the criminal justice system isn't black and white. There's a lot of gray in there. So on face value, this should be something that I would want to listen to. I think when I went back and started thinking about it, it's because it was really written like it would be written for a true crime book that we might have read in the 90s. It wasn't written for audio. There was just a lot, I felt like filler to me. And that took away from connecting with the actual restorative justice story. Didn't really pick up until halfway through this. So for me, that was what I wanted to hear about. And I feel like there was a lot of background that, was relevant, but we didn't need to hear as much of it. So I think it was the way that the story was told just wasn't for me. So this is a thumbs down.
Toby Ball.
Yeah. If you're interested in listening to a podcast about sort of grief and forgiveness and stuff, don't listen to my review because it's just not my cup of tea. I think there were definitely issues with it, which I think other people will go into a little bit more. But for me, it's just the subject matter was not super interesting. The things that I do find kind of interesting about particularly forgiveness, I don't feel like it really delved into. I think it was more sort of following a family's journey of grief and forgiveness without asking some questions, which I would have liked to have heard people talk about. So anyway, again, not for me. So I'm a thumbs down.
Kevin Flynn.
Yeah, I'm a mild thumbs up on this, actually. I do like the concept of restorative justice. I do think it's very powerful. I have to say, I did find myself sort of sympathizing with more, at the very least, putting myself in that position, trying to find the words that, one could express remorse or respect for the victims. I am not a murderer, but anybody who drives a car could take somebody's life, and that the burden for that is heavy. And the story, I had a visceral reaction to it. So that's a testament to the storytelling, but it really didn't sort of pick up until the last half. Again, I don't know if sometimes we say, well, they're obligated for 8 episodes, and so this is why we get there. The first half, I wouldn't call it filler, but it certainly felt like more prologue than the actual story. I found that part to be pretty good, but it's imperfect. It's certainly not as good as the original season of The Letter, which I thought was pretty revelatory. But as far as an interesting listen, something that'll make you think, I still think there's some stuff here for you.
I'm a thumbs sideways. I'll tell you what I would definitely be a thumbs down on is the podcast about David Duchovny talking about failure, which I heard 10 million ads for in this podcast. We don't need that. We don't need a celebrity talking about failure to other celebrities. That's a hard no for me. That being said,
isn't my life terrible?
Jesus Christ. I generally like the podcast that Lemonada makes a lot. To me, the flaw with this one is that the real story is, does this guy deserve this family's forgiveness. That's the real story, because he could be manipulating them. The problem is there's no way to know that in 2024. There's just no way. But if that's going to be the exploration, put that at the heart of the story, which I think they tried to do, but they tried to do it too late, as Kevin said.
At the very end, yeah.
And so those were the parts that actually interested me. And those parts, when I got there, I was interested in. And this podcast isn't like poorly made. Like, it sounds really good. Amy Donaldson is very likable as a reporter. And, there aren't people in this podcast that I was like, oh, God, if I have to listen to this person for 2 more minutes. It wasn't anything like that was like objectionable. So it's hard for me to be like down. But I agree, it's not for me. But yeah, I'm a hard sideways on it. Yeah, hard. All right, now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the Crime of the Week. Police in Japan have arrested a man for fraud. Turns out he was juggling 35 girlfriends. He's not charged with being a womanizer, though. Instead, he told each one he had a different birthday so he could have a constant stream of presents. Well, I kind of like that. Authorities say Takashi Miyagawa was born in November, but celebrated birthdays in each fiscal quarter. He raked in gifts that included electronics and high-end clothing. Miyagawa met most of the ladies through his job in multi-level marketing, selling hydrogen water shower heads. After some of the girlfriends discovered his ruse and did their own investigation, they reported him to the police. Authorities say there could even be more victims out there. Panel, gift giving can be so challenging. What do you give the man who has 35 birthdays? Laura Bricker, what do you think?
A box of condoms and some antibiotic soap, perhaps, so that he doesn't lose his, man parts servicing all those women. I don't know.
That's why he's got the hydrogen water shower head. What is hydrogen water, by the way?
I don't know. You have to go to that multi-level marketing scheme to find out.
Buy a bunch.
Toby Ball, what do you give the man who has 35 birthdays?
I think he's probably gotten a lot of presents over the years, but probably not any Laura Bricker leggings.
That's true. Kevin, what do you get the man who has 35 birthdays?
Burner phones.
Oh, I thought he might have a birthday advent calendar, but one of those reusable ones that you can use again and again and again.
Yeah.
All right.
A little chocolate inside.
All right, Laura Bricker, if folks want to follow you online and see videos and photos of you drinking out of a horn, how can they find you there?
They can find me at Laura Bricker on Twitter and Instagram.
And Tony Ball, how can you be found online so folks can engage with you?
At Toby Ball NH.
And what about you, Kevin? I know you're elusive, but you are still sometimes lurking on the digital web.
At Kevin P. Flynn.
If you want to follow me everywhere, you can find me on Twitter or Instagram. My handle everywhere is at Reb Lavoie. You can also follow the show everywhere. Our handle is Crime Writers On. You can follow us on YouTube. You can follow us on Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, but mostly you should go to Facebook, find us there, and join our incredible group. It's called the Official Crime Writers On Facebook Discussion Group. There's one question to get in, and we make it super easy. Literally, you have to just know one of our names. Get episodes early and ad-free and all the other amazing stuff we make at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. Our theme song was composed and performed by Ty Gibbons. Our editor is the terrific Livy Burdett. The executive producer of this program is Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in the Treehouse Yoga Studio above the Mockingbird Cafe in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, the Closet, in our New Hampshire basement, where we also are now fluent in at least 5 languages.
Buongiorno.
On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later.
Ciao.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. It'd be helpful if I opened my script.
That's great.
Crime Writers On.
Olivia was wondering when there was going to be an outtake in this, and it is right at the very beginning.
Celebrate incredible savings during NFM's 4th of July sale. Pay 55 cents on the dollar, plus take an extra 11% off the current price on all furniture, carpet, and area rugs. Get up to $1,000 off appliances. The more you buy, the more you save. Save up to $500 on select electronics. And get 24-month financing on qualifying purchases. Shop amazing store-wide savings during NFM's 4th of July sale happening now. Minimum monthly payments required, 18% APR. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.